How about the Cuban Missile Crisis? Cocksuckers moved nuclear warheads into Cuba, pointed them right at us.
That was real? I saw that movie. I thought it was bullshit.
What's poppin', fellow weirdos? Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 246, the last episode of Spooky Month. And you know what that means. Boo! Did I get you? You might remember the end of the last episode, 245, I postulated that Tartaros were the greatest spooky Halloween black metal band. But then I hit you with the twist ending saying maybe they're not, maybe there's another band. This episode's about that other band. We're talking about Gehenna, also a high-quality Norwegian symphonic black metal act. These guys are old school as fuck. They are from like the very beginning of the Norwegian black metal movement. And their first album, aptly entitled First Spell, is a personal favorite of mine. It's also perhaps the most gothic black metal album to come out of Norway back in the old days. And I don't just mean gothic in the sense that most people mean when they say gothic black metal, something like Enthrall or Dismal Euphony or Bloodthorn, where it's like stereotypically gothic black metal with the female vocals and the heavy keyboard presence. No, we're talking about full-on goth rock shit like Joy Division or Bauhaus type stuff, but in black metal. Mostly due to a serendipitous accident of dirge reps, idiosyncratic drumming style, and Sarkena's very
boo! Haunted house!
Selection of keyboard sounds. I mean, just listen to that keyboard tone. It's delightfully... But it's also nowhere near as bombastic as would usually be the case for a symphonic black metal band. Gives the whole thing kind of a unique feel, which is further enhanced by Sanrab and Dolgar's much softer than usual guitars for black metal, but particularly Dirge Rep's drumming, which is very surprisingly kind of post-punk, even has some motoric beats in it like an old krautrock band or something. Particularly when he does that really quick double snare hit. Probably the most danceable black metal performance since Burzum's flirtations with Eurobeat style percussion on Philosophem. And like Philosophem, Dolgar's vocals on this EP are a lot more subdued than is normal for black metal. But the main standout element of this release that gives it that Halloween feeling is Sarkena's keyboards, which don't really have the usual level of precision you expect from symphonic black metal keyboards. I'm not going to say they're sloppy, but they're way more organic and alive sounding, a little bit more rhythmically fluid. I've used a lot of terms like subdued and laid back to describe the various elements of this album, but one thing that isn't very subdued is the acoustic guitars. As you can hear, they have quite a bit of bite to them, which really sticks out through the gray haze that is the rest of this album's mixing. As you've probably intimated by now, First Spell is an album mostly predicated on texture, and they have some really weird sonic textures. For instance, the beginning of Angel Wings and Ravenclaws has this bizarre ringing keyboard sound. Bro, set your phone to vibrate when we're recording, sheesh. Now, for what reason could you possibly think it was a good idea to have that sort of noise on your album? Well, I postulate to you that it will make more sense as we venture further into the song and that phone tone starts to expand. Right around here. It's no longer just those two oscillating tones buzzing over and over. Instead, it has been ironed out into a more concrete melody, which now is doing some really cool counterpoint to that initial melody with the guitars. Almost sounds kind of Satyricon-ish, but these guys were contemporaries, not rip-offs. And that contrast between these very concrete melodies and that initial ringing tone, which I believe is about to come back right now, that's your clue as to what I think might have been going on when they were doing this. Earlier on, I mentioned Burzum's Philosophem album. I think this might also be an example of them doing something kind of Burzum-y, because doesn't kind of sound like a recreation of this sort of noise, but done on a keyboard instead of a guitar. Now, this could all just be in my head, because I've been listening to First Spell since I was like 17 or some shit. Might have listened to the album a few too many times, thought a little bit too much about it. But I gotta think Angel Wings and Ravenclaws is them trying their hand at an old Burzum compositional trick, where you started out with a single droning tone that gradually opens up into more solidified melodies. Witness the title track to Burzum's Tartaros album, where it starts out with these like two very droning tones just kind of hopping between a couple different chords, slowly grinding out the genesis of a melody, which gradually emerges from the murk. Now, in the full unedited version of this Burzum song, that whole process takes about 10 minutes. I thought I'd edit it down for you just to give you a quick example. And I think that's what Gehenna was doing with those odd keyboard tones. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a very texture-based album. And with those wacky goth rock sounding elements, the Norwegians beat the Swedes and the French to the punch as far as that depressive rock black metal fusion thing goes by about a decade. And if you ask me, they did it way fucking better.
Shots fired! Shots fired!
It's somewhat surprising then that by the time Seen Through Veils of Darkness, our second spell, was released, pretty much all of those goth rock adjacent elements were gone. It's still an album with a whole lot of focus on texture, but it has a little bit more conventional evil black metal sound to it. And speaking of texture, check out the song Lord of the Flies.
We've got to be sensible and make things work!
Maybe I'm taking things a little bit too literally, but doesn't that particular guitar tone and melody they've chosen sound an awful lot like a fly buzzing? This transition riff right here is total epic Bathory style Viking metal. And then it goes into some great atmospheric keyboard work offset by some pretty thick rhythm guitars. They don't stick on it for too long, but if you're enjoying it, don't you worry. You'll get that back later on in the song. But for now, we have to get into one of the most surprising sections of any black metal album that I've ever heard. You can tell they're building up to something pretty nasty, and here it is. Absolutely monstrous thrash break. Probably the nastiest sounding one I've heard since the one in the middle of Desecration of My Soul on the first Obtained Enslavement album. At least as far as thrash breaks on the symphonic black metal album go. But they don't stick with the standard thrash metal format, oh no. They bring back that buzzing fly guitar tone from earlier and add to it these sort of halfway between screamed and sung vocals before going back into a transition riff, which will signal the triumphant return of that awesome spooky gothic melody from earlier, now with added layers of jangling clean guitar. Hell of a way to start the album off. Second spell also features a couple of redos of songs they had written back during their demo days, the most notable of which being A Witch is Born.
Satanic black magic. Sick shit.
This song in particular is kind of cool because it shows them flexing their narrative muscles, with chunks of the story being interlinked by little guitar parts, such as this one. New to the arsenal of keyboard sounds that have always defined this era of Gehenna for me are some really cool choral effects. As you can tell, the vocals are a lot harsher and more conventional black metal this time around, which fits the subject matter. And that thrash break earlier wasn't a fluke when you hear stuff like this. Really cool incorporation of much more percussive than normal for black metal guitar phrases. And now we are into the titular witch being born, signified by some very menacing sounding mid-paced riffs that gradually ramp up in speed and intensity until the moment of impact, as it were. Which in turn, after a very cool dirge rep drum fill, will lead us into probably the most Sarkana's keyboards have ever sounded. It's interesting to hear her jumping from the very gothic and minimalist organ work of the first Gehenna album to the wide panoply of sounds that we've got going on in this record. So even if it isn't doing that same sort of very unique goth rock influenced black metal thing like their first album was, Seen Through Veils of Darkness is an undeniable black metal classic. They would follow that up with their third spell scarcely a year later, entitled Malice, which unsurprisingly saw them pushing into even more new directions. And like Necromancia's fourth album, which was also entitled Malice, for some reason the third Gehenna album seems to be a little bit overlooked by people. Maybe there's just something about naming your album Malice that brings on a sense of unluckiness. This album was, at its time of release, by far the heaviest thing they had ever done. You can already tell how much thicker the guitar tone is. The feeling of menace that creeps into their second album is fully present on this release as well, as are that same wide variety of different keyboard tones that Sarkana was using on the prior album. Interestingly enough, if you read a lot of interviews from the band at the time, time, apparently they were mostly listening to a whole lot of classic metal as opposed to more extreme stuff. And you can certainly hear that on sections like this where it almost sounds like a more sped up Candlemass riff or something. The keyboards under that melodic riff also kind of give me an Edge of Sanity vibe, which is interesting. Here's a weird little back and forth between some sort of weird melodic tech thrash riff and some kind of spooky thing. It sounds like early Psy, dude. This is a highly varied album in terms of the different sounds they pull off. And it's about to get very, very spooky. With that deranged thrash metal gallop and those weird outer space evil circus keyboards. But it doesn't even stay thrash, it goes back into the depths of heavy metal history with this new wave of British heavy metal style gallop riff. Parts like this you can see why they would say we're mostly into classical metal nowadays. So overall, Malice, amazing album, unjustly overlooked, and also kind of the end of an era for Gehenna, because after this album, Sarkana leaves, although she does do some guest keyboard work for them in the future, and Dirge Rep leaves to join Enslaved, and they underwent a pretty massive style change. Originally, this episode was supposed to come out last week, and Tartaros was going to be this week, because I felt like I had a better handle on the Gehenna albums I liked a whole lot than I did on the Tartaros stuff. I've probably been listening to Tartaros since like 2011. I've been into Gehenna since at least 2006.
But
I figured, I should probably talk about the later Gehenna albums a little bit. It had been many years since I'd listened to them at all, and the main thing I remembered about them was it was a massive style change, given that the only original songwriters remaining were Dolgar and Sanrab. I didn't remember liking these albums very much, but in the interest of fairness, I was like, I should probably give it an extra couple weeks to go through the latter half of the Gehenna discography, see what's going on. And it turns out, yes, it is a massive change from their earlier stuff, which will always be my favorite material from them, but it's not necessarily a change for the worse.
Hey there.
Oh my God, I'm sorry, I don't have any change.
Did you ever think maybe it's you who needs the change?
What?
The first of this new era of Gehenna came with the album Youre On Black, which featured a much heavier emphasis on groove and brutality than had heretofore existed in their music. It doesn't even really sound like the same band. But for what it is, that being this very groove-based, brutal brand of black metal, it's some really good stuff. It almost reminds me of a prototype for what bands like Kraft would be doing in the early 2000s. If this album had been released by anybody but Gehenna, I think people would talk very highly of it. There's the guest keyboard work from Sarkana that I was talking about, indicating that this is sort of a bridge between that first era of Gehenna and their new one. In fact, all of Youre On Black, as good as it is, for me personally, it kind of pales in comparison to the next album, Murder, which is where the changes really took place, and they honestly completely flipped genres. Because on this album, they pretty much just became a death metal band. A very unique sounding death metal band. Again, with the heavy emphasis on groove. Kind of reminds me of the style changes going on with fellow Norwegians Eternus, or even Samoth from Emperor starting up the very Morbid Angel sounding Zyklon. But honestly, I like this album a hell of a lot more than either of those projects. There's something really demented about how mechanical it all sounds. The vocals give me Jorgen Sandstrom on Grave's Soulless vibes, which is always a positive. That's one of my favorite death metal albums. I mean, it still dips into fast-blasting, semi-melodic black metal from time to time, which helps lend a sense of dynamics to the overall concoction, but it very quickly transitions back into that sort of early Decapitated style, modern, brutal, groovy death metal. Speaking of dynamics, there's also quite a bit of doom metal on here, doom death to be specific. But even that isn't just your average, normal, everyday doom death stuff, because it still maintains that frantic atmosphere, particularly when they keep the double bass drums going under those morbid, hanging riffs. Even more so than Youre On Black, if Murder had been released by a band that wasn't Gehenna, honestly I think people would be talking about this as a modern day classic. Then there's another chunk of years of inactivity before they come back in 2005 with the bizarrely titled album WW.
My approval rating was in the 30s. My nominee for the Supreme Court had just withdrawn. And my vice president had shot someone.
Which is my least favorite of all the Gehenna stuff I've heard, but it's still more than decent. It was on this album, they went full Moonfog sound. They went so Moonfog, they got fucking Frost to drum on it. That's the other reason why I'm doing the Gehenna episode after the Tartaros episode, is because on the Tartaros episode, I got to explain to you what the hell the Moonfog sound was. So now I can just jump right into this last Gehenna album. Speaking of Frost, this came out the same year as 1349's Hellfire, and it definitely works as a more cybernetically minded companion piece to that particular slab of black metal brutality. There's also a lot more of like old school mayhem styled weird bendy riffs going on than ever had been a factor in Gehenna's music before, particularly during the mid-paced sections. The preponderance of Thorn-style riffs is probably the reason that I've run across a lot of people that say this is their favorite Gehenna album, more traditionally minded black metal people. I mean, as far as black metal hot takes go,
No way, not a chance.
but still somewhat defensible. I mean, certainly spooky, eerie, cold riffs like this probably gets your hackles up on Halloween. Not to the same extent that their classic albums would, though. And that about does it for Gehenna. And that also about does it for our October black metal Halloween spooktacular. You know, maybe you'll remember that next time you feel like whining about a Visual K episode. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
What, are you getting cute with me?
No.
I think you are. I think you're getting a fucking attitude on you.